We have so much emerging evidence that Atlantis was real, and not only that, but other civilizations, that it's becoming overwhelming. I want everyone for a second just to take a step back and be like, I don't care about Plato's story right now. Let's put that off the side. I'm so sick of people saying that that's the only reason Atlantis is around or exists because of Plato. That's not true.
Can you give the context of that for people who aren't familiar?
Yeah. People will say, a lot of mainstream will say that Plato made up the entire story of Atlantis based on an allegory to compare against the pre-Greek culture to show their superiority as democracy versus an empire. He's got all kinds of stories in that. But what I would point out is, no, he only used the example of what was real to then show. Because we're working on releasing the new season of Ancient Civilizations 5 on Gaia. And what we do is we go deep into telling the actual evidence to prove Atlantis existed in a way that nobody else has. But not only that, to prove that there was another rival civilization that existed at the same time called the Ancient Athenians, the pre-Greeks. Now,
and how many years are we going back with this?
We're going back over at least 20,000 years because Plato gives us the date of Atlantis' destruction. Solon is basically an Athenian Greek priest or poet who is the first person from the outside world to come into Egypt and learn about this ancient history that they didn't know. And I haven't even told the story of Atlantis yet.
Well, let's stay on that. I don't want to get you off it.
Yeah, I don't want to. So what we need to point out is that the story doesn't come from Plato. The story comes from much earlier ancestors. It comes from a man named Solon, who came before Socrates. Okay, Solon was a Greek poet and philosopher who was the first person from the outside world to travel to Egypt thousands of years ago. This is before the Roman Empire went and basically destroyed Egypt. And I think that's important for us to understand. Yeah. What happened was Solon goes and visits this incredible temple called the Temple of Sais, S-A-I-S. And it was a real temple, and there's been art depictions drawn of it because it was destroyed after Solon left. We don't know exactly how long, but after Solon learned about the story I'm about to tell you and left, within the next 1,000 years, the Temple of Sais didn't exist any longer. Somebody destroyed it. Somebody wiped this story that I'm about to tell you. Solon goes down. He finds this incredible temple near Heliopolis in Egypt. And he finds this elder priest named Sanchez. Okay, Sanchez, this is a name for people that want to look it up. And he had a bunch of other priests with him, but Sanchez was a special kind of priest. He was an elder priest that knew absolutely ancient, I mean, like, I say absolutely in quotes. He knew ancient history so old that it wasn't really even recorded by most other places in the world anymore.
And how did he know that, allegedly?
The Temple of Sais had inscriptions writing the entire history of Earth down. The Temple of Sais was supposed to be like the Library of Alexandria, not that far away. That was supposed to be a library of the works of people through literature and all these things. But the Temple of Sais was supposed to be this way to record our history. And it's described that these priests were, the single thing they were supposed to do, there was nothing else, was to maintain the story of history. And they had this entire story of this ancient civilization called Atlantis written into their walls. And they say that Egypt came out of Atlantis. And what he says is, Solon, you Greeks remember one deluge, but there have been many that have come before, primarily of water and fire. Goes on to tell him that what we think of as the old world is not even that old, and that there's ancient chapters of civilizations that have come, risen, been destroyed, and then tried to rise up. But every time they were destroyed, more and more knowledge was lost and not less. So Sanchez tells Solon this entire story, and he takes it back and he tells it to two people. He tells it to Diodorus, who's another Greek philosopher. I love Diodorus. I wish people would lean more on Diodorus than Plato for the story of Atlantis. Diodorus, and he told Socrates. Plato wasn't even around yet. That's what people don't know, is that it wasn't, and Socrates didn't feel like it was, he believed that we shouldn't write things down because they could be misunderstood, which is kind of silly, because he used to give talks, and eventually he was poisoned by his own government. Just so you know, he was killed. Socrates was murdered by his own government for speaking out. And when that happened,
That's sketchy.
Plato talks about how it was it was like losing a father, and how he then took up the role of writing every piece of knowledge that Socrates had taught. Socrates was like his great mentor. He taught everything to Plato. So he took on this task of writing everything that Socrates had told him. But knowing that Socrates, this is why I need people to understand this. Knowing Socrates had just been murdered by their own government, poisoned because of speaking out, he couldn't write the story of Atlantis down. So he wove it into, put it into an allegorical story so that people would, like, the truth would be preserved, but also they would think it's an allegory and it's not real. He's brilliant. Like, he did it so that he could be preserved. He had to do that. That's how the story went. And that's where but Diodorus and Plato and Solon and the Sanchez priest of the Temple of Sais, this isn't a myth. Like, this is real. And the Egyptians say that there was a grand civilization that existed west of the Pillars of Hercules, okay? Straits of Gibraltar in Spain. And that it was a civilization that lived somewhere around the Azores in the MidAtlantic Ridge. And they were right on the MidAtlantic Ridge. So people that don't know what that is, it's two tectonic plates that come together in this massive area, and it's one of the most active places in the world for earthquakes and volcanoes. Why would you build a civilization on that? Well, that gets into other, like, whole questions about whether or not they were trying to utilize energy in a certain way or something. Right? Because it seems like we keep finding examples of these civilizations that, like, built right on a fault or something, or built somewhere that's unstable, but obviously they have different reasons for doing it.
But on the surface, it seems like it goes against their supposed intelligence that they had. Like,
they're not thinking like we do. They're not like, oh, hey, look, there's plenty of water over there for agriculture. This is a great climate. We can, like, chill out, hang out. They don't care about that. These were advanced people. They already mastered that. They already mastered all those things. They were now doing something for other reasons that we are still trying to figure out, like, why the pyramids were created.
Well, dumb question here maybe, but thinking across some of these different periods, across the different Younger Dryas type periods, is it possible that from an evolutionary perspective, some of the people we're talking about are not humans the way we are humans? There's some other type of life form that's in a similar plane but is in some ways different?
So one of the things that the big rabbit hole we're going to go down when we get to it, because this is all just sort of, just so everybody knows, this is literally just laying, like, the framework for what we're about to talk about. We haven't even gotten to it yet. What we find is that there was an obsession in the ancient world over bloodlines. And I mean, like, an obsession. We talked last night about how the Egyptians in the Book of the Dead would be obsessed with this idea of a being that was a ruler that they thought was like a descendant of the gods, that they would go through processes to try to bring that soul back in after it died to rule again. That's how obsessed they were, was that they saw it as being something, and I don't want this to come across as being some kind of a racial or superior thing, but all people on earth are amazing and beautiful. They had the opinion that there were gifts within those bloodlines that connected to these ancient Anunnaki Anuna gods of Sumer, right? To lay it out there.
Some of this stuff, like, there's a lot of details going on, so if there's a couple things you repeat here and there, just bear with me. But do we know how long approximately Atlantis could have lasted for, like when it began, if we know where it ended?
The best we can do is, and I placed Atlantis as being created 50,000 years ago, based on, honestly, largely circumstantial evidence, but we have to put it somewhere. And I base that on geologic history of that region, when things occurred, and I also base it on, I do think that Edgar Casey, who was a psychic medium, is one of the only few that I actually think was legit.
What
Throughout
makes
history.
You think he was legit?
The things he said a lot of them have come true. And
like what?
Like when he discusses aspects of Atlantis and what happened later, it matches up with, like, archaeological evidence and evidence from that period of what was happening. And it gives credence to the fact that they had recorded as much as they could about this. And then even, like, the temple priests of Sais were ultimately either killed or died, and the temple was destroyed. And so I want to throw this out there, but if Solon had never visited Egypt, we would never know any of this existed.
Well, that's the other thing, too. When I've heard people in the past talk about Atlantis, there's arguments over when, there's arguments over where, and it seems like it's all over the map. So what, like...
But Plato gives very detailed descriptions of where it is and how big it is and how many rings it has, and that it was located basically all like Randall breaks it down in his podcast, Randall Carlson, really well, is that, listen, we're pretty sure it was like right where the Azores are. If you go look at bathymetric charts of the seafloor, you can see that there was a plateau of land that was underneath that area that was like wiped out. Now, the descriptions of how it was destroyed is important because it says that it was subducted and sank into the ocean. Now, when we look at plate subduction, plates moving, it's on the MidAtlantic Ridge. Exactly where plates are moving right there.
So maybe it got,
So if we were to have a plate dive under the other one during catastrophe things with the Earth, it literally can take that entire civilization, whatever, and just sink it to the bottom of the ocean, which is exactly how it's described. That's exactly how it's described. And the weird thing, and I want to add one little thing to that, there's this really bizarre set of ruins that validate that. Off of the western tip of Cuba, in the early 2000s, they found these incredibly bizarre ruins at 2,000 feet underwater. Like, you want to pull up something really quick?
Please.
Go look up Sunken City off of Cuba really quick.
Sunken City off of
Now, this is what gives credibility to the
Cuban
fact.
underwater formation.
Click that right there. What that is there was some marine engineers that were hired by the Cuban government.
Holy shit.
Yeah. So there were marine engineers hired by the Cuban government in the early 2000s to go search off of Western Cuba using sonar to find shipwrecks and like gas deposits. And they had no interest in archaeology at all. And what happened was they were surveying 2,000 feet underwater off of Western tip of Cuba in this massive sandy plateau that was literally like miles and miles and miles long with no rocks or anything. And they come across this set of structures that is 11.5 by 11.5 miles.
I'm going to put the picture in the corner of the screen.
Actually, I think it's square. It's square miles or whatever, but the surface area is enormous.
These pyramid-looking things.
So what they found is that they pull up these. They used sonar recreation to create what's on the floor because it's 2,000 feet below the ocean. What they found is
apparently that's not too deep in light of the Titanic.
Yeah, right.
Go down there in a fucking tin can.
What they found is it almost made them not share it because they thought they're going to be ridiculed. They found this, and they used these recreated sonar images, and they were baffled. And Zelensky is his name. He sat on his computer, I guess, for months, and one day he had a calendar next to him, and it had a picture of Mayan ruins. And he like freaked out because he realized that this is right off of the Yucatan. It's between the Yucatan and Cuba. Of course, the Mayan civilization is very mysterious and is supposed to have potential links to Atlantis. He shares this with a geologist named Iturralde in Cuba, who comes out for a second expedition and starts getting the interest of National Geographic. Okay? So Iturralde goes with him. He's a geologist from Cuba, and they go with a submersible to the wreckage, and it dives down, and they analyze it, and he says he's completely baffled by it, and that it's not natural by any means, and that the structures look like a series of streets, temples, pyramids, and if anything, mimics.
Yeah, what's the right? So the right side of this picture again. I'll have that in the corner of the screen. So we have the pyramid-looking things on the left.
Yes.
But is that supposed to be on the right side, like those street patterns?
Yeah, but notice in the bottom part of the image, there's severe destruction.
Yeah.
Something happened here. There's stuff strewn all over the place. They described it as massive blocks that were strewn all over the ocean floor. Now here's where it gets bizarre. They built the blocks out of what looked like giant granite, just like we see in other parts of the world, and they were cut very precisely. And the geologist said, and this is where I get another theory of Atlantis. Iturralde, the Cuban geologist, says that the only time that part of the ocean could have been different enough geologically would have been 50,000 years ago. He said exactly that number.
That's where, okay.
He said exactly 50,000.
That gave me a little goosebump
right?
there.
He says 50,000 years ago, just like Edgar Casey said about Atlantis. Now, here's I want to add another little thing for you to freak you out. There was a Tibetan library in the 1901 or so, where there was a traveling anthropologist expert in the region in Tibet. And he met with this Buddhist monk who had told him that he had discovered a secret library known as the Cave of 1,000 Buddhas. Okay? In that library, up in this cave up in the mountains, in that library, he found these manuscripts from all over the world, from different like Hindu texts and all these things. But one of them had a map, had an ancient map in it. And the map depicted Atlantis as a region that existed from west of the Pillars of Hercules as a region all the way to the Yucatan. And that really was.
How big would that make it?
That means that those ruins off of Cuba are part of Atlantis.
So
that's what it means.
It's stretching across the whole fucking earth.
It means that it's part of Atlantis. That's why we see similar architecture in Peru than we do in Egypt and we do in our other parts of the world.
But obviously, we know Pangea was like millions of years ago, so that's
not
completely irrelevant.
Yeah.
But is there any type of possible explanation that says the plate movement could have like shifted things way off course? I mean, that seems way too far for me for that. That's crazy.
Here's the thing that's weird. Every single ancient structure in the ancient world, cities or whatever, they align themselves to true north. Okay, magnetic north. All of them did. They were obsessed with cardinal points and understanding all of that. It had to do with energy. Every single one of them, every single one, anywhere in the world, is off by magnetic north by 23.5 degrees. Every single one of them.
Perfectly.
If you look today at the axis of the Earth and what creates the seasons, there's a 23.5 degree shift on the Earth, which is what creates the precession of the equinox. Oh my God. It means that when those structures were created, we did not have an axial tilt that we have today, which is why they describe the ancient world as being very different climatically and geologically than it is now. Something happened so significant during Younger Dryas that it shifted the axis of the Earth.
Hey guys, thank you for watching the clip. To watch this full episode of the Julian Dorey podcast, hit the link in the description below.